Don't bother me with pregnancy scams. A woman like you is a temporary distraction, not a mother to my legacy." Caspian sneered, his voice cutting through the silent penthouse like a sharpening blade. He didn't even look up from the dark grain of his mahogany desk, his focus entirely on the stack of $100 bills he was counting out. Elara stood before him, her hands trembling as they clutched the fabric of her blue cleaner's tunic. The smell of industrial bleach still clung to her skin, a bitter reminder of the distance between them, a distance she had foolishly thought they'd crossed in the heat of the midnight hours. "It's your child, Caspian," she whispered, her voice cracking against the weight of his indifference. He finally looked at her then, his eyes as cold and unforgiving as the Chicago winter outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. He stood slowly, towering over her, and tossed the money onto the table as if it were trash. "This is for the scam, Elara. Take it and disappear. If I see your face or hear about this pregnancy again, I won't be using cash to settle the debt. I'll be using lead." He turned his back, dismissing her life and the life inside her as easily as a smudge on a window. Elara looked at the money, then at the man she had loved in secret, and felt something inside her shatter and then harden into ice. Without touching a single bill, she turned and walked out, leaving the skyscraper, the city, and the monster behind. She had 5 years to build a fortress. He had 5 years to forget. Neither realized that blood doesn't stay buried forever. Please support this channel by subscribing. Your subscription truly means a lot. Now let's continue with the story. 5 years was a long time to live as a ghost, but Elara Vance had mastered the art of being invisible. In the quiet, salt-misted town of Oakhaven, she was no longer the woman who scrubbed floors in a Chicago skyscraper. She was simply Clara, the soft-spoken assistant at the local library who always smelled faintly of old paper and sea air. She had traded the sterile scent of industrial bleach for the comforting aroma of vanilla and cedar, a shield she used to mask the identity of the woman who had once loved a monster. Her new world was anchored by a small, weathered cottage on the edge of the cliffs where the cedar shingles were silvered by the spray of the Atlantic. It was a humble life, far removed from the mahogany desks and glass empires of the Moretti syndicate, but it was hers. Every morning, she would wake to the sound of the tide and the steady breathing of the boy sleeping in the room next to hers. Kaelen was the only living proof of the scam Caspian Moretti had so cruelly dismissed. At 5 years old, he was a constant reminder of the man Elara had tried to erase from her heart. He was a beautiful, quiet child with a mind that moved faster than most adults, but it was his eyes that often made Elara's breath hitch in her throat. They were an intense, piercing gray, a lethal gaze that felt far too heavy for such a small face. When he looked at her, she saw the ghost of the Mafia Heir staring back, a living legacy that Caspian had tossed away like trash. At the library, Elara found a strange kind of peace. She spent her days organizing forgotten histories and helping the townspeople find stories of escape, all while living her own. The rhythm of the town was slow and predictable, the complete opposite of the high-stakes violence she had fled. Here, the only shadows were cast by the towering pines, and the only threats were the winter storms that rolled in from the sea. She worked hard, saving every penny from her modest paycheck, determined to ensure Kaelen never knew the hunger she had felt in the first few months after her flight. She had built a fortress out of routine and silence. She didn't have friends, only kind acquaintances who knew her as a devoted mother and a hard worker. She avoided the news, never looked at the headlines from Chicago, and kept her head down when expensive cars passed through the coastal roads. To the world, she was Clara, a woman with no past and a quiet future. But late at night, when the wind howled against the cedar shingles, she would sit by the window and watch the dark horizon. She knew that monsters didn't just disappear because you stopped looking for them. She had spent 5 years perfecting her disappearance, living as a ghost among the living, but deep down, the ice in her heart told her that some debts were never truly settled with cash. The passage of time in Oakhaven was measured not by the ticking of a clock, but by the steady growth of the boy who shared Elara's soul. As Kaelen's 5th birthday approached, the small cottage on the cliffside felt increasingly crowded. not by his physical presence, but by the weight of the man he was becoming. It was a genetic inevitability that Elara watched with a mixture of profound love and paralyzing dread. Kaelen was no longer the soft-featured infant she had shielded in the dark. He had thinned out, his movements becoming precise and deliberate. But it was his face, the chillingly perfect reconstruction of Caspian Moretti's features, that felt like a silent alarm ringing in the quiet of their coastal life. He possessed the same high, sharp cheekbones and the same widow's peak of dark hair, but the eyes were what truly haunted her. They were a piercing, light-colored gray, a shade so cold and clear they seemed to look through people rather than at them. Even at 5, Kaelen didn't just look at the world. He observed it with a lethal, calculating intensity that belonged in a boardroom or a dark alley, not a sunny library. His nature was as precocious as his gaze. While other children his age were content with toys and simple games, Kaelen moved through the world with a gravity that was almost unnerving. He was unnaturally observant, noticing the slight tremor in Elara's hands when a black car slowed down near their driveway, or the way she checked the locks on the doors twice every night. He didn't ask questions. He simply adapted, positioning himself between his mother and the door whenever a stranger knocked, his small frame tensing with a protective instinct that was far too advanced for his years. It was a shadow of the man who had once stood over Elara in a Chicago penthouse, but where Caspian's power had been used to discard, Kaelen's was used to guard. Elara tried to temper this intensity with the softness of Oakhaven. She filled their days with the gentle rhythms of the library and long walks along the shore, hoping the sea air might wash away the predator's edge in his eyes. She watched him carefully as he interacted with the local children, noting how they naturally deferred to him, drawn in by a quiet authority he didn't even know he possessed. He was a king in a playground, a legacy of command, manifesting in the most innocent of settings. On the evening of his birthday, as the sun dipped below the Atlantic horizon, Kaelen sat on the porch steps, staring out at the darkening water. Elara watched him from the doorway, her heart aching at the silhouette he cut against the twilight. He turned to her, those gray eyes catching the last of the light, and for a moment, the 5 years of peace she had fought for felt as fragile as glass. "Mom," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "you don't have to be afraid. I'm here." The words, meant to be a comfort, sent a shiver of terror through her. He had seen the fear she thought she had hidden so well. He was already assuming the role of the protector, the heir to a throne he didn't even know existed. As she pulled him into a hug, feeling his small, sturdy heartbeat against her own, Elara realized that while she had successfully hidden herself from the world, she could never hide Kaelen from the blood that ran through his veins. The scam had grown into a boy who carried his father's lethal stare, and the fortress she had built in Oakhaven was starting to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a cage waiting to be opened. While the Atlantic spray was busy silvering the shingles of a cottage in Oakhaven, a different kind of frost was settling over the glass and steel heights of Chicago. In the penthouse of the Moretti Tower, Caspian sat behind the same mahogany desk where he had once shattered a woman's life with a stack of bills. But the air in the room felt thinner now, depleted of the oxygen of purpose. The city skyline spread out below him like scattered diamonds, just as it had 5 years ago, but the view no longer felt like a kingdom to be ruled. It felt like a prison cell with an expensive view. The empire Caspian had sacrificed his soul to maintain was starting to show hairline fractures that no amount of blood or money could seal. His desk was piled high with reports of missed shipments, insubordinate captains, and a shifting loyalty among the other families that signaled a scent of weakness in the water. He was the heir to the Montero Empire, a man raised from birth to value power over love and loyalty to the family over everything else, yet the very family he had protected now felt like a leaden weight around his neck. Every decision he made was calculated to project strength, yet internally he felt a creeping hollow that made his victories taste like ash. His marriage to Natalia Ricci, intended to be the ultimate power move, a flawless alliance between the two most formidable syndicates in the city, had devolved into a cold, silent business arrangement. There were no whispered promises in the darkness of their bedroom, only the clinical discussion of assets and the suffocating pressure of a legacy that refused to grow. When the truth finally surfaced that Natalia could not provide the heir the empire demanded, the irony was not lost on him. He had rejected the child of a woman who truly loved him, only to be trapped with a woman who regarded him as a strategic partner and could offer him no future. Karma, he realized during the long, whiskey-soaked nights, was a debt that collected its interest in the form of a slow, agonizing loneliness. The penthouse, once a symbol of his absolute authority, now echoed with the ghost of a nurse he had called a nobody. He told himself he didn't think about Elara anymore, yet he still kept a white lace-edged handkerchief hidden in his bedside drawer, the only remnant of a woman who had dared to refuse his money and disappear without his permission. He found himself staring at the Chicago skyline and seeing only the pain in her brown eyes when she had asked him about love, a question he had answered with a cruelty that had effectively destroyed the only real thing he had ever possessed. Now, the man who was feared by the entire underworld couldn't find peace in his own home. His soul felt like a decaying building with no elevator, a place of stained walls and hollow rooms where he paced until the early hours of the morning. The power he had traded his heart for was slipping through his fingers, and the legacy he had prioritized over a human life was turning to dust in his hands. He was the head of an empire that was cracking under the weight of its own cynicism, and as he poured another glass of whiskey, the lethal gray eyes in the mirror looked back at him with a weary recognition. He was a king, ruling over a graveyard of his own making. The expansion of the Moretti footprint into the northeast was supposed to be a purely tactical maneuver, a way for Caspian to outrun the encroaching rot of his Chicago alliances. Oakhaven was nothing more than a coordinate on a map, a sleepy coastal town slated for a luxury resort development that would serve as a front for his new shipping routes. He arrived in a convoy of black SUVs that looked like ink blots against the pristine coastal fog, his presence a dark intrusion into the quiet rhythm of the seaside. Caspian moved through the town with the detached efficiency of a predator, his gray eyes scanning the quaint storefronts and salt-worn boardwalks with a cold, professional disdain. He was a man who lived in the clouds of steel and glass. The grounded, organic life of a place like Oakhaven felt like a foreign language he had no interest in learning. The air in the town was thick with the scent of brine and pine, a sensory profile that tugged at a memory he had spent 5 years trying to bury. He stepped out of his vehicle near the town square, his tailored suit a sharp, dark contrast to the weathered flannels of the locals. Gianni, his ever-silent shadow, stood a few paces behind, but Caspian barely noticed. He was distracted by a peculiar sensation, a tightening in his chest that he hadn't felt since the night he tossed a stack of bills onto a mahogany desk and told a woman to disappear. He dismissed it as the altitude or the unfamiliar air, but the feeling only intensified as he turned toward the local market, a bustling hub of activity where the townspeople gathered for the morning catch and fresh produce. He walked through the market with his head held high, the crowd parting naturally before his aura of command. He was looking for the developer, a man he intended to intimidate into a more favorable percentage, but his gaze was suddenly arrested by a flash of blue fabric near a flower stall. It was a simple, unassuming color, but the way the sunlight hit the woman's hair, a deep, familiar chestnut, made the world around him go silent. Caspian slowed his pace, his breath hitching in a way that felt like a physical blow. She was laughing, a soft, melodic sound that he hadn't heard in half a decade, as she tucked a small bunch of wildflowers into a woven basket. It was her, Elara, the nobody nurse who had vanished as though she had never existed. She looked different, weathered by the sun and the sea, her eyes carrying a hard-won peace instead of the desperate love he remembered, but there was no mistaking the curve of her jaw or the way she stood with a quiet, unyielding dignity. But she wasn't alone. Caspian's world fractured when he looked down at the child standing by her side. A boy, no older than 5, was holding her hand, his other hand occupied by a wooden toy boat. The child moved with a precision that was chillingly familiar, a grace that shouldn't belong to a toddler. As the boy looked up to show Elara something on the ground, the sun caught his eyes. They were a piercing, lethal gray, a perfect, biological mirror of the man standing frozen in the middle of the marketplace. The child's face was a miniature reconstruction of Caspian's own, from the sharp cheekbones to the stubborn set of the mouth. The realization hit Caspian like a gunshot to the heart. This wasn't a scam or a low-level distraction. This was his blood, walking the earth in a pair of scuffed sneakers. He watched as Elara leaned down to ruffle the boy's hair, her expression one of such fierce, protective love that Caspian felt the hollow in his soul expand until it threatened to swallow him whole. For 5 years, he had convinced himself that he had preserved his legacy by rejecting her. Yet here was his true legacy, growing in the salt air while he sat in a crumbling tower of glass. He stood paralyzed, the ruthless Mafia Heir reduced to a ghost in his own life. The boy, Kaelen, suddenly turned his head, his intense gaze locking onto Caspian's through the crowded stalls. There was no fear in the child's eyes, only a quiet, unnerving observation, the look of a predator recognizing its own kind. Elara, sensing the shift in her son's attention, followed his gaze. When her brown eyes met Caspian's gray ones, the basket of flowers slipped from her hand, the colorful blooms scattering across the cobblestones like a broken promise. The 5 years of silence between them vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by a cold, screaming reality that neither of them could outrun. The silence that followed the crash of the flower basket was more devastating than any explosion Caspian had orchestrated in the streets of Chicago. For a heartbeat, the bustling Oakhaven market seemed to freeze, the salt air thickening until it felt like lead in Elara's lungs. She didn't move to pick up the scattered blooms. Her hands, once skilled at healing and later at scrubbing, were now frozen at her sides. She felt Kaelen's small hand tighten around her fingers, his grip a grounding wire that kept her from drifting away into the nightmare, standing 10 feet away. Caspian took a step forward, his polished shoes crunching on the petals of a discarded carnation. The movement was predatory, a habit of a man who had never been denied entry into any space he desired. But Elara found her voice before he could close the distance. It wasn't the voice of the nobody nurse who had wept in his penthouse. It was the voice of a mother who had survived a Portland storm and 5 years of ghosthood. "Don't," she whispered, the word carrying enough edge to stop him in his tracks. Caspian looked down at Kaelen, his gray eyes, the boy's eyes, widening as he processed the sheer biological impossibility of the sight. The boy didn't flinch. He stepped slightly in front of Elara's leg, his 5-year-old chest puffing out, his own lethal gaze meeting the man's with a chilling mirroring of intensity. "Get in the car, Elara," Caspian commanded, though his voice lacked its usual iron. It was raspy, shaken by the ghost of a legacy he had tried to erase. "I don't work for you anymore, Caspian, and I certainly don't obey you," she said, her voice growing stronger as she pulled Kaelen toward the edge of the market. She didn't run. Running invited a chase. She walked with a deliberate, trembling dignity toward the alleyway that led to her parked, beat-up sedan. She almost made it. She was fumbling with the keys when a shadow fell over her. Caspian slammed his hand against the car door, pinning her between the rusted metal and his expensive wool coat. Gianni stood at the mouth of the alley, his back turned to give them a semblance of privacy that felt more like an interrogation. "He has my face," Caspian hissed, his eyes darting to Kaelen, who stood by the rear bumper, watching the interaction with a stillness that was terrifying. "He has my eyes. You told me it was a scam, Elara. You let me believe." "I let you believe?" Elara cut him off, a sharp, hysterical laugh bubbling up in her throat. She looked him directly in the eye, refusing to be the liability he had once labeled her. "I stood in your office, Caspian. I told you I was carrying your child. I told you I loved you. And do you remember what you said? You didn't even look at me. You counted your money and told me not to bother you with pregnancy scams. You told me a woman like me was a temporary distraction." Caspian's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. "I was protecting the Empire, the alliance with the richest." "The Empire," Elara spat the word like it was filth. "You chose a stack of $100 bills over your own blood. You sat in your tower of glass and decided that my life and the life of the son you're currently staring at wasn't worth the risk to your shipping routes. You paid me to disappear, Caspian. Well, look at me. I disappeared. I did exactly what the great Mafia Heir demanded. I didn't know it was him, Caspian said, his voice dropping to a low, desperate frequency. He reached out a hand toward Kaelen, his fingers trembling, a weakness Elara had never seen in him. I didn't know he would be this. Elara stepped in front of his hand, physically blocking his view of the boy. The movement was sharp and final. You don't get to touch him. You don't get to know his name. You don't get to see this, because this is the result of 5 years of me working 3 jobs while you were attending galas with your wife. This is the boy who saw his mother cry herself to sleep for a year because she thought she wasn't enough to keep him safe from men like you. He is a Moretti, Caspian growled, the arrogance of his bloodline resurfacing through the shock. He is the heir to everything I have built. He is nothing to you, Elara countered, her face inches from his. You told me you didn't need an heir from a nobody nurse? You told me to settle the debt, or you'd settle it with lead. Do you want to settle it now, Caspian? In a coastal town alleyway in front of the child you wanted to erase? Caspian flinched as his own words were weaponized against him. The scam he had dismissed was now a living, breathing reality that made his entire empire look like a house of cards. He looked past her at Kaelen, who hadn't moved a muscle. The boy's gray eyes were unreadable, but the protective stance he took, fists clenched at his sides, was a mirror of the man Caspian was supposed to be. I have resources, Elara. I can give him a life you can't even dream of. Caspian tried, the businessman in him attempting to negotiate with a woman who had moved beyond the reach of currency. You can give him a life of blood and glass, she said, her voice now dangerously calm. You can give him a target on his back and a hollow soul. But he already has a life. He has a mother who chose him when the whole world, including his father, told her to give up. He has a home that smells like vanilla and sea air, not gunpowder and whiskey. He has everything he needs, and none of it belongs to you. She shoved past him, her shoulder hitting his chest with a force that surprised them both. She unlocked the car, ushering Kaelen into the back seat. The boy didn't take his eyes off Caspian as the door closed, the click of the lock sounding like a gavel. Elara got behind the wheel, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at Caspian through the window, the man who had once been her entire world, and saw only a stranger clutching at the ruins of a life he had chosen for himself. Don't come near us again, she said through the cracked glass. The scam is real, Caspian, and it's the only thing in this world that you will never be able to buy. As she reversed out of the alley, leaving the Mafia Heir standing in the shadows of the coastal town he had come to conquer, Elara felt the first true spark of victory. She had built a fortress out of silence, and though the walls had been breached, she realized she was no longer the one who was afraid. Caspian Moretti was the one left in the cold, staring at a legacy that had no room for him. The salt air of Oakhaven, which had served as Elara's sanctuary for 5 years, suddenly felt thick with a different kind of ozone, the sharp metallic scent of impending violence. As she drove away from the alleyway, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, each pulse echoing the terrifying realization that the fortress of her invisibility had been razed to the ground. In the rearview mirror, she saw the silhouette of Caspian Moretti standing motionless, a dark stain against the coastal light, but her instincts, honed by years of looking over her shoulder, told her he wasn't the only shadow in the mist. She didn't know that while Caspian had been consumed by the shock of seeing his own lethal gaze reflected in a 5-year-old boy, other eyes had been watching from the periphery. A rival faction, the Vane Syndicate, had been trailing Caspian's convoy from Chicago, waiting for a moment of weakness to strike at the cracking foundation of the Moretti Empire. They had watched the untouchable heir descend from his armored SUV to confront a local librarian, and more importantly, they had seen the child. Through long-range lenses, they had captured the undeniable proof. A boy who was the genetic double of the man they intended to destroy. To the Vane faction, Kaelen wasn't a child. He was the ultimate leverage, a secret heir, whose existence was worth more than all the shipping routes in the Midwest. Elara pulled the car into the gravel driveway of her cottage, her breath coming in ragged hitches. She ushered Kaelen inside, her movements frantic as she threw the heavy deadbolt, a lock that suddenly felt as flimsy as paper. Kaelen stood in the center of the small living room, his posture unnervingly still. He didn't cry or ask why they had fled the market. He simply watched his mother with those piercing gray eyes, his small face a mask of that precocious, protective intensity that had always chilled her. He moved to the window, his hand resting on the cedar sill, his gaze fixed on the dense line of pines that separated their home from the main road. "Mom," he said, his voice a low, steady frequency that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "There are men in the trees." The blood drained from Elara's face. She didn't question him. She knew Kaelen saw things others missed, a predatory intuition inherited from the man who had discarded them. She grabbed her phone to call the local police, but the line was dead, a silent digital execution. Outside, the birds had stopped singing, replaced by the low, guttural thrum of a high-performance engine idling just out of sight. The vain hitman didn't care about the quiet dignity of Oakhaven or the life Elara had built from the ashes of her past. They saw only a target. A window shattered in the kitchen, the sound of glass spray painting the linoleum like diamonds. Elara didn't scream. She acted on a primal reflex, diving for Kaelen and shoving him into the crawl space beneath the floorboards, a hidden sanctuary she had prepared years ago for a moment she hoped would never come. "Stay silent," she hissed, her eyes locking onto his lethal gray ones. "No matter what you hear, do not come out." She had barely closed the trapdoor when the front door splintered inward. Two men in tactical gear stepped into the cottage, the smell of gunpowder and expensive tobacco polluting the scent of vanilla and sea air. They moved with a clinical efficiency, their silenced weapons leading the way. One of them, a man with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow, looked at Elara with a sneer that reminded her painfully of Caspian's rejection 5 years earlier. "Where is the boy, Clara?" he asked, using her Oakhaven alias with a mocking lilt. "We know he's the Moretti legacy. We know he's the only thing that cold-hearted bastard actually cares about, even if he doesn't know it yet." Elara stood her ground, her body a trembling but unyielding wall between the intruders and the trapdoor. "I don't know who you're talking about," she lied, her voice cracking with terror but fueled by a fierce maternal rage. "There is no boy here. Just me." The man laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "We saw the eyes, sweetheart. You can't hide blood like that. It shines like a beacon." He signaled to his partner, who began to systematically tear the cottage apart, flipping furniture and smashing the few precious mementos Elara had gathered. The Oakhaven ghost was being exorcised by the very violence she had tried to outrun. Meanwhile, less than a mile away, Caspian was staring at the scattered flowers in the marketplace when the first report from Gianni hit his earpiece. His rival's signature vehicles had been spotted heading toward the cliffs. The realization that his presence had brought the wolves to Elara's door turned his blood to liquid nitrogen. He had spent 5 years believing he was protecting his empire by rejecting her, but in a single hour, he had realized that the only part of his empire worth saving was currently in the crosshairs of his greatest enemies. He didn't wait for his convoy. Caspian shifted his SUV into gear, the tires screaming against the cobblestones as he raced toward the cottage. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about shipping routes, alliances, or the Moretti name. He was thinking about the boy with the toy boat and the woman who had looked him in the eye and told him his money was worthless. He was the heir to a syndicate of blood, and as he sped toward the cliffs, he realized he would burn Oakhaven to the ground if it meant keeping that lethal gray gaze from being extinguished. Back at the cottage, the lead hitman caught sight of the edge of the trapdoor. He shoved Elara aside with a brutal force that sent her crashing against the stone fireplace. As he reached for the handle, Elara scrambled to her feet, grabbing a heavy iron poker from the hearth. She swung with everything she had, the metal connecting with the hitman's shoulder, but it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a pebble. He backhanded her, and the world went gray at the edges. "Found you, little prince," the hitman muttered, his hand wrapping around the trapdoor ring. The salt air was now thick with the scent of blood on the coast, and the quiet life of Clara was gone forever. The collision of two worlds had become a war, and the stakes were no longer just a secret heir. They were the very survival of a family that had never been allowed to exist. The roar of Caspian's SUV engine drowned out the crashing surf as he skidded into the gravel driveway, the scent of burning rubber mixing with the salt spray of Oakhaven. His eyes, usually a mask of calculating indifference, were wide and frantic as he saw the splintered front door of the cottage. The Oakhaven ghost had been flushed out, and the silence that followed the breach was the most terrifying sound Caspian had ever heard. He didn't wait for Gianni or the rest of the convoy. He vaulted from the driver's seat, his hand already gripping the cold, familiar weight of the suppressed handgun holstered at his side. He had spent years trying to build a clean corporate image in Chicago, but as he stepped over the threshold of the home he had never been invited into, he felt the old, lethal darkness of the Moretti bloodline rising to the surface. Inside, the cottage was a graveyard of the quiet life Elara had built. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. He found Elara slumped against the stone hearth, a crimson gash across her forehead, her eyes fluttering as she struggled to regain consciousness. But it was the open trapdoor in the center of the room that made his heart stop. The small, hidden sanctuary was empty. Kaelen was gone. "Elara," Caspian rasped, dropping to his knees beside her, his fingers pressing against her pulse. She gripped his lapels with a strength born of pure desperation, her eyes snapping open to meet his with a look of absolute agony. "They took him, Caspian," she choked out, her voice a jagged shard of glass. "The man with the scar. They took our son." The word son hit Caspian with the force of a physical blow, more powerful than any bullet. For 5 years, he had operated under the delusion that money was the ultimate arbiter of fate, that a stack of $100 bills could erase a human life. But as he looked at the blood on Elara's face and the empty space where his child should have been, he realized that his wealth was a useless pile of paper. Money couldn't buy back the 5 years he had lost, and it certainly couldn't buy Kaelen's safety from men who only understood the language of lead. To save his legacy, he couldn't be the billionaire developer or the strategic partner. He had to return to his monster roots, the very man he had tried to bury to appease his Chicago alliances. Caspian stood, his movements becoming precise and terrifyingly calm. The panic that had gripped him in the car was replaced by a cold, predatory focus. He looked at the muddy boot prints leading out toward the cliffs and the idling black sedan disappearing into the fog near the main road. He knew the Vane tactics. They wouldn't kill the boy immediately. Kaelen was their golden ticket, the leverage they needed to force the Moretti Empire into a total surrender. "Stay here," Caspian commanded, his voice returning to the iron authority of the syndicate heir. "Gianni is behind me. He will take care of you." "Save him, Caspian," Elara whispered, her hand falling away from his coat. "Don't let them turn him into you." Caspian didn't answer. He couldn't. He knew that to save Kaelen, he had to become the very thing Elara feared most. He raced back to his vehicle, the GPS already tracking the burner phones of the Vane hitmen. He drove with a reckless, lethal intent, cutting through the winding coastal roads like a dark streak of lightning. The Vane faction had a 2-minute head start, but they were driving a heavy sedan. Caspian was driving a machine designed for war. He cornered them at the old lighthouse at the edge of the Cape, a desolate stretch of rock where the Atlantic roared with a hunger that matched his own. The Vane sedan was blocked by a fallen pine, and 3 men were dragging a struggling Kaelen toward a waiting speedboat at the base of the cliffs. Even from a distance, Caspian could see the boy's light-colored eyes, his own eyes, locked onto the horizon with that chilling, precocious intensity. Kaelen wasn't crying, he was fighting, his small boots kicking at the shins of the man with the jagged scar. Caspian didn't call out a warning. He didn't offer a bribe. He simply stepped out of his SUV and began to fire. The first hitman fell before he could even draw his weapon, a clean shot that echoed the clinical efficiency of the Moretti training. The second man dived for cover behind the sedan, returning fire that shattered Caspian's windshield, but Caspian didn't flinch. He moved forward with a relentless, mechanical gait, his focus entirely on the man holding his son. The scarred hitman pressed the barrel of his gun against Kaelen's temple, his face contorted in a desperate sneer. "Drop it, Moretti, or the secret heir dies right here on the rocks." Caspian stopped 10 feet away, the salt wind whipping his dark hair across his face. He looked at Kaelen, and for a fleeting second, the boy's lethal gray gaze met his father's. In that look, there was a recognition, a silent communication between two predators of the same blood. Kaelen didn't look afraid. He looked like he was waiting for the opening. "You think you're the first person to threaten my blood?" Caspian asked, his voice a low, vibrating growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. "You think I value my own life more than the legacy you're holding?" "I know you value your power," the hitman spat, his finger tightening on the trigger. "And I'm taking it away." "You're making a mistake," Caspian said, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not the man who counted money in Chicago anymore. I'm the man who was raised to burn everything down to protect what's mine." In a move that was purely instinctual, Kaelen suddenly bit down on the hitman's hand with a ferocity that made the man holler in pain, the gun wavering for a fraction of a second. It was the only opening Caspian needed. He fired a single, perfect shot. The scarred man collapsed into the surf, his grip on Kaelen vanishing as he was swept away by the tide. Caspian dived forward, catching Kaelen before the boy could fall onto the jagged rocks. He pulled the child into his arms, crushing him against his chest, the scent of sea air and adrenaline filling his lungs. Kaelen was shaking, but he didn't pull away. He leaned into the man who had once rejected his existence, his small hands clutching the expensive wool of Caspian's coat. "You came," Kaelen whispered, his gray eyes searching Caspian's face with an intensity that broke the last of the Mafia Heir's defenses. "I'm here," Caspian replied, his voice breaking as he realized that no amount of money could ever equal the weight of the child in his arms. He had returned to his monster roots to save his son, but as he looked at Kaelen, he realized the transformation had only just begun. The father's choice was made. He would no longer be the heir to an empire of glass. He would be the shield for the boy who carried his eyes. The adrenaline that had fueled Caspian's reckless charge to the lighthouse ebbed away, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity that no amount of Chicago whiskey could ever provide. As he sat on the rugged Maine shoreline, the weight of Kaelen's small, shaking frame against his chest felt more substantial than the entirety of the Moretti Tower. He looked at the boy's gray eyes, eyes that were currently wide with the shock of seeing his father deal in the currency of death, and realized that his monster roots were a poison that would eventually consume the very legacy he was trying to protect. For 5 years, Caspian had operated under the delusion that he could maintain a sanitized corporate front while keeping the syndicate's machinery running in the shadows. He now saw that the shadows were precisely what had led the vain hitman to this doorstep. To keep Elara and Kaelen safe, he couldn't just defeat his enemies, he had to destroy the world that created them. He had to execute the great dismantling. The decision was a total betrayal of every principle his father had beaten into him since childhood. Loyalty to the family was supposed to be absolute, a blood pact that outweighed the law, morality, and even personal survival. But as Caspian drove back to the cottage, his hand resting protectively on Kaelen's shoulder, he felt a strange sense of liberation. The empire was already cracking, hollowed out by greed and infertility. It was a ghost of a kingdom, and he was tired of being its lead mourner. When he arrived at the cottage and saw Elara standing in the doorway, her forehead bandaged and her face etched with a terror that only began to melt when she saw Kaelen, the final piece of his resolve snapped into place. He didn't just want a second chance. He wanted to earn the right to exist in the same air as the woman who had rebuilt a life from his ashes. "I'm ending it, Elara," Caspian said that evening, the flickering light of the cottage's fireplace casting long, tired shadows across his angular face. "Not just the war with Vane, all of it. The Moretti syndicate, the Chicago alliances, the shipping routes. I'm burning it all down." Elara looked at him, her brown eyes searching for the scam he had once accused her of, but she found only a weary, lethal honesty. "They won't let you just walk away, Caspian. Men like that don't have a retirement plan. They won't have a choice. Caspian replied, his voice dropping to that low iron frequency. I'm not walking away. I'm turning it over. The Great Dismantling began with a secret meeting in a non-discourse government building in Boston. Caspian sat across from two federal agents who had spent a decade trying to pin a single felony on him. He didn't bring a lawyer. He brought a hard drive filled with 5 years of encrypted ledgers, digital footprints of money laundering schemes, and the names of every corrupt official on the Moretti payroll. He offered them the ultimate prize, the total internal collapse of the Midwest's most powerful shadow syndicate. In exchange, he demanded only one thing: total immunity for himself, a new identity for Elara and Kaelen, and a witness protection detail that would treat the Oakhaven cottage like a fortress until the last Moretti captain was behind bars. The agents were skeptical. Why now, Moretti? You're the king of the hill. Why hand us the keys to the castle? Caspian leaned forward, his gray eyes reflecting a light that was no longer cold but fiercely focused. Because I have a son who has my eyes, he said, his voice unwavering, and I refuse to let him inherit a graveyard. Over the next few weeks, Caspian operated like a ghost within his own empire. He continued to issue commands from the safe house, but every move was a trap designed to gather more evidence. He orchestrated business expansions that were actually sting operations and loyalty tests that led his most dangerous lieutenants straight into federal custody. He watched through secure monitors as the Moretti syndicate, the legacy he had once prioritized over Elara's love, was methodically stripped of its power. Each arrest felt like a weight being lifted from his soul. He was trading his throne for a chance to be a nobody, and for the first time in his life, the bargain felt heavily skewed in his favor. The danger, however, was far from over. The syndicate was a multi-headed hydra, and as the dismantling progressed, the remaining heads became increasingly desperate. Caspian lived in a state of perpetual vigilance, his predatory instincts now serving as a shield for the family he had once discarded. He stayed awake through the coastal nights, watching the perimeter of the cottage, his hand never far from his weapon. He was the man who had only told Elara what she needed to hear 5 years ago, but now he was the man who stayed silent so she could sleep. Elara watched the transformation with a cautious, blossoming hope. She saw him sitting on the floor with Kaelen, helping the boy build a new wooden boat to replace the one lost at the lighthouse. She saw the way his lethal gaze softened when he looked at their son, a transformation that money could never have bought. He was no longer the Mafia Heir who sneered at pregnancy scams. He was a man dismantling his past to ensure their future. The Great Dismantling wasn't just about the syndicate. It was about the wall Caspian had built around his own heart. As the final arrests were made in Chicago and the Moretti Tower was seized by the government, Caspian stood on the cliffs of Oakhaven, watching the fog roll in over the Atlantic. The empire was gone. The bloodstains on his name were being scrubbed away by the very authorities he had once evaded. He was a man with no title, no syndicate, and a bank account that was now under federal oversight. He was, by his own previous definition, a nobody. But as Kaelen ran toward him, his gray eyes shining with an innocent, unburdened excitement, Caspian realized that he had finally found a legacy worth carrying. The monster was dead, and in its place stood a father who had finally chosen love over power. The transformation of Caspian Moretti was not a sudden event, but a slow, rhythmic erosion, much like the way the Atlantic tides had spent centuries carving the rugged cliffs of Oakhaven. The man who had once sat behind a mahogany desk in Chicago, sneering at the idea of a pregnancy scam, had finally been buried under the weight of his own choices. In his place stood someone the world no longer recognized, and more importantly, someone Caspian himself was finally beginning to understand. He was no longer the heir to a shadow syndicate or a billionaire developer with a target on his back. He was simply a man living in a house that smelled of cedar and salt, learning the quiet, difficult language of being a father. The Great Dismantling had left him with nothing of his former life. The Moretti Tower was a hollow shell owned by the federal government. His associates were behind bars, and the vast wealth he had once used as a weapon had been forfeited as part of his penance. To the outside world, Caspian Moretti was a ghost, a name whispered in the dark corners of Chicago's history. But in Oakhaven, he was becoming something real. He spent his mornings not in clandestine meetings, but in the small garden behind the cottage, his hands, once stained with the metaphorical blood of a syndicate, now stained with the literal soil of a new beginning. Elara watched him from the kitchen window, her heart finally finding a steady rhythm after 5 years of living in a state of perpetual flight. She had traded her alias Clara for her true name, no longer needing the protection of a lie. The Oakhaven ghost had been exorcised by the truth, and in the aftermath, she found a man she never thought could exist. She saw the way Caspian's lethal gray gaze, once a mirror of his own father's coldness, had softened into something protective and warm when it landed on their son. It was a transformation that money could never have bought, a legacy built on the ruins of an empire of glass. Kaelen was the bridge between their shattered past and this fragile future. At 5 years old, the boy was a living testament to resilience, possessing a wisdom that far outstripped his years. He still had his father's eyes, intense, piercing, and observant, but the shadow of the predator was fading. Under Caspian's patient guidance, Kaelen was learning to use that focus for creation rather than defense. They spent hours on the porch, the former Mafia Heir teaching the boy how to carve intricate designs into pieces of driftwood. Caspian's fingers, once accustomed to the cold steel of a handgun, were now surprisingly delicate as he showed his son how to follow the grain of the wood. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold, Kaelen looked up from his carving. "Dad," he asked, his voice steady and clear against the sound of the crashing waves. "Are we going to stay here forever?" Caspian paused, his knife hovering over a piece of cedar. He looked at Elara, who had joined them on the porch, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. The touch was no longer hesitant or filled with the memory of his betrayal. It was a choice, a commitment made again each day. "As long as you want to, Kaelen," Caspian replied, his voice carrying a depth of emotion he had once considered a weakness. "The only legacy I want to leave you is this house, this coast, and the knowledge that you are loved. Everything else, I burned that away a long time ago." The quiet life they led was a masterpiece of simplicity. Caspian found work at the local shipyard, using his analytical mind to manage logistics for a small, legitimate fishing fleet. He was a nobody to his co-workers, a man who worked hard and kept to himself, but he was everything to the woman and child waiting for him at the end of the day. He had traded the suffocating luxury of a penthouse for the honest exhaustion of manual labor, and for the first time in his life, he slept without the need for whiskey to drown out the silence. Elara had returned to the library, but this time she walked through the town with her head held high, her presence no longer a secret to be kept. They were a family forged from ruins, a collection of broken pieces that had been painstakingly glued back together with forgiveness and time. The scars of the past remained. The gash on Elara's forehead had faded into a thin silver line, and Caspian still woke up occasionally in a cold sweat, checking the locks, but the fear no longer controlled them. They had learned that a second chance was not a gift, but a labor, something earned through the daily dismantling of the people they used to be. As the stars began to pierce the dark velvet of the main sky, the family stood together on the cliffs, watching the lighthouse beam sweep across the water. It was the same light that had witnessed Caspian's monster roots rising to save his son, but now it served only as a guide for the ships coming home. Caspian wrapped his arm around Elara, pulling her close, while Kaelen stood between them, his hand clasped in his father's. The scam had become the only reality that mattered. The boy who had once been a temporary distraction was now the center of a world that was whole. Caspian looked out at the infinite dark of the Atlantic and realized that the great dismantling was finally complete. He was no longer the man who told people what they needed to hear. He was the man who stayed to build what they needed to survive. In the salt air of Oakhaven, the new legacy had taken root, a legacy not of blood and glass, but of love, choice, and the quiet, enduring strength of a family that had finally come home. The waves kept rolling in, as they had for millions of years, erasing their footprints from the sand but leaving their souls intact. Tomorrow, they would wake up and choose each other again, and the day after that, and every day until the final breath. Forever was no longer an empty promise made in a secret hotel room. It was the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a new life on the coast.